Yes, thank you for having me, and sorry that I couldn't make it personally, but yeah, times are not easy sometimes. Yes, I want to do a short overview about what standardized cannabis production means actually, and why it's separated from others like field or greenhouses. Here's a short overview about the content of this presentation. I just will start now. Yeah, and when you're talking about standardization of plant products, there was a standard way of doing that in the food industries for ages, I would say. And it worked quite well when you look on that most customers, they don't see or taste the difference in the most food products they get, which are plant-based. But if you look on the standardization from a pharmaceutical way, then that's definitely not enough. But I will give a short overview about what classical standardization of plant products actually means. As usually it starts, of course, with planting standardized seeds, seedlings, or clones. But we all know if you have a standardized seed or clone and putting it on the field or in the greenhouse, it doesn't mean that the whole product in the end is really standardized. But for food product, normally enough. Next step on the list is, of course, the harvest. And we know from tea plants where people just harvest the upper level of the plant. And by taking those similar parts of a plant, you're reaching a point of standardization, which again is mostly enough for having food products standardized. The next one is actually the most important one in the classical way. It's the blending of different fields, harvests, and vintages. So the harvests from different years. For example, in chamomile or in wheat, you see it all the time that those companies are delivering to the market, they're keeping different fields and harvests and different harvests from different years and blending them together to reach a point where the product is really as standardized as possible just from the plant side of things. Again, most customers, when they drink a whiskey out of the wheat, they never taste the difference in the whiskey because it is blended. And again, this is not enough for pharmaceutical use of the product. The next step, which is also used often in the food industry, but also in the pharmaceutical industry, is of course, creating an extract which is qualified and standardized, which is way easier to do with an extract than with a plant itself. So there you're reaching a point when you have an extract which is close to what we want to have for real pharmaceutical product and way beyond what the normal customer in the food industry is expecting. So what is the difference from this approach, the classical approach, to a more progressive way? In the progressive way, you actually use even more standardized genetics. While in the field, you can get along with seeds which are more or less standardized. In a real closed environmental approach where you want to have real standardized product, you need genetics which are very stable and very controlled in any regard. But again, even then, you have a standardized genetics. It's normally not enough to create uniform and really standardized products in your grow room. So therefore, you should look at cultivate tissue cultures because the clones from that are way more stable and way more uniform, and therefore going to a point where you have way better results in standardization. Next big point, of course, is growing under controlled environment, because on the field and in the greenhouse, the environment changes the plant, and by changing the plant, it's also influenced the ingredients of the plant. So you normally have a big deviation between different products in the field, and in a controlled environment room, you can minimize that to a very, very narrow line. The other point which we see often is actually plant size. A lot of the people in grow rooms have plants which are relatively high and big. And when the plant grows that big and high, then you always have within the plant different environmental zones. Upper levels, higher levels, inner and outer parts of the plant are divided very much by those environmental factors. And you see it when you test them in the ingredients or in the compounds itself. It's very much not the same level of product you want to. That's why plant size is an often overseen but important part of growing a standardized plant product. And again, like on the field, harvest separation or the standardized batch control by doing a harvest of similar plants from each plant, so that you have, for example, a batch which only covers the top collars of the plant and another batch which covers the outer part of the plant. You can go to the point where you have a batch control which is even way higher than what is normally happening in the field. To sum up that, the comparison between this classical way and this more progressive way is, in the end, for food or most cannabis products in the recreational market, it's fine to have a product which is not so standardized. But if you want to do a plant-based product which actually using the plant or using an extract of the plant, more control in the first part of growing the plant means more control of your final product. And when we was using customers in the past and ask them what is their biggest problems with cannabis product in the market in general, then one of the most given answers was always that the product is not the same like it was last week or the week before. So even in the so-called recreational or medical market, a lot of the customers complaining that the product is changing so often. By a standardized process of plants in the growing phase, you come to a point where you have a product which not only smells and tastes and looks like the one you had in the week before or the month before, but actually you can see the difference when you look on the data of the COAs and you see, oh, this product is actually the same product like the one a month before, or very close to that. That's actually already the next topic. The quality of cannabis flowers is relatively different to which area you go, actually. When we're looking, for example, flowers versus extracts, and of course, a lot of the products in the markets are extract-based. And for those products, of course, a classical way of growing the plants is always or mostly good enough, because most extracts are that standardized that the most customers are not able to see any difference. But when you already look at flowers, then of course most customers realize that your growing patterns changed and you have a difference from batch to batch, which is often very big. So it is very important to look on what is your product actually and what is the growing method which matches this product the best. Besides the flower and extract discussion, the discussion about the recreational and medicinal cannabis is similar to that. Like the majority of the market is dominated by customers who want to have a cheap product. Cheap product always means you have to have a big cultivation in place and you have to grow massive amounts. And it always means, of course, that you have to grow it on the field, because growing in greenhouses or in indoor facilities is never as cheap as a field-grown product. But on the other side, in the recreational or so-called medicinal cannabis market, we have also customers who are asking for quality as their main driver for buying a product. And when it comes to quality, you never get the same quality of a field product or greenhouse product than you can get in an indoor facility where you have a controlled environment in place. So even besides pharmaceutical cannabis, there is a reason to grow environmental controlled cannabis indoors for recreational or medicinal cannabis use. And when we come to the pharmaceutical cannabis, of course, because we need a very standardized product and we need to have full control about every aspect of the plant, not only about the compounds we want, but also on the compounds we definitely don't want to see in our product, like pest and residuals of heavy metals and other things. So we want to have a very controlled product in the end, and that's why we have to have a very controlled process from the beginning on, which starts with the selection of seeds and genetics, but goes over the growing and even the harvesting and packaging afterwards. To make this picture a little bit more clear, I go now in some of the details of how we do standardized control product in our facility and what we actually do. It always starts first with the design of your facility. Besides things like airflow and, of course, product flow, it's very important that your design is able to look at the cause and effect of everything what happens in the facility. So, like, it's important that how the equipment components react with each other, how the plant growth is influenced by equipment components, but also on how the product flows within the facility and how that influences your growing. When you're looking just into the grow room, some of the most important factors are actually like biomass accumulation. For example, as the plant is growing, the plant changes their environment and changes humidity and temperature to other plants. That's often a factor which is overseen by a lot of growing facilities, that they are not looking at this effect and how this changes actually the environment for the plants and again changes the compounds. Another big factor is, of course, light energy and how that affects temperature in the room or not. In the past, we had always lamps which were very hot, of course, as everybody knows, but those lamps had a big effect on the temperature of the plants, higher versus upper levels of the plants, and so on. So it's very important to keep in mind that whatever you do in the room is affecting your temperature, your humidity, and even your air modeling. And therefore needs to be thought of in the beginning before you actually start to build your facilities. Another big thing is, of course, irrigation events. And in the moment where you're putting water flow into a facility or into the room, then the water, of course, changes your humidity again and changes the effect of every plant. So it's important to keep in mind those main factors, but also all the little negatives, which are often overseen, and to be aware that every plant needs to get the same environmental and other conditions like any other plant in the room to have a standardized product which actually separates yourself from the rest of the industry. Besides the design, next big factor is always the biosecurity. You see a lot of industry members where their facilities have not enough hygiene and cleanness in place, and then they're wondering why their harvests are changing so much. Yeah, it's pretty easy if you have developed always biofilms in all over your company's rooms and equipment, or you have influence of outside pathogens and others, which always changing your product, then it's clear that you can't have the same product from batch to batch, which means it's very important to have a system in place where cleaning and disinfection has a big, big role. Like every project, the most important part is always the team working inside the facility. Therefore, it's important that there's a cleaning routine within the team, that they know how to clean themselves and disinfect themselves when they're entering rooms, when they're moving materials from one room to another. Because often you see already in facility design that the design is not made to separate those products like the fresh plants, like the new incoming bio products, or even the garbage, which is not transported in a way where it can be separated from all the other material flows. When you do it under GMP, of course, you're used to it and you know how to do those things. But a lot of the indoor facilities are not under GMP rules, and therefore they're often lacking this awareness of how important the cleanness and the prevention of biofilms is actually for your production. Next big part, of course, is the genetics itself, as mentioned before. To have a standardized product in the end, you not only have to look on how stable is the genetic itself, but also is the genetic matching your approach of growing. So is this a tendency to go very big, or is this a tendency to go very wide and have by that a big influence on how your room would actually work with this kind of plant. Also, because we don't have those stable genetics right now on the market, it's often important to look at the phenotypes and which one of those matches your wished components, but also your growing pattern the best. And of course, again, the morphology of the plant, it's so important to be aware how the plant is growing, which will be the flower structure in the end, what is the growing leaf index, and of course, things like flower time, general yield, and also, of course, pest and pathogen resistance are so important to think of even before you using this genetics. So testing genetics, developing them in the right way, doing the right phenotyping. And of course, in some cases, if you realize that the market has no genetics available, you actually need to meet your targets in the end. And of course, breeding your own genetics is, or giving someone the order to do it for you, it's a very important part of developing a real standardized product. Because if the genetics are not standardized, then the final product can't either. Even if you have a genetic which working great or which is stable and having all the compounds you need, you can get to an even higher level of uniformity and even higher level of control, which using your own tissue culture program. Again, as I mentioned in the biosecurity part, if you bring in a biological product into the facility, you always taking big risk of taking pathogens and pests inside the facility or even inside your grow room. So having your own tissue culture prevents you from being under risk to bring in something in your grow room or in your facility you don't want to have there. But beside that, this important factor, the tissue culture gives you a more control about actually which kind of cells of the plant you have and how they will develop. It brings you to the point where you have a very clean and very standardized starting point for your circle. And again, as more as your plants are standardized when they start to grow, then as higher is the level of standardization you have in the end. You can get to a uniformity which you don't get with clones or seedlings or even seeds themselves. And you can control even more how the components of the plant will be in the end. And of course, it's also a matter of time and volume, because tissue culture is a relatively cheap and relatively easy to handle process compared to mother rooms or seedlings production. And again, less levels of variation in the tissue or in the young plants give you less variation in the compounds in the end, which is actually what we want to achieve. Yeah, of course, cultivation itself is a very important point. And the most important point with cultivation is actually controlling the environment. To control the environment, I think it's mandatory to monitor every aspect in the room. And you see often control systems in rooms which actually looking at certain areas in the room and using those data they get from those spots in the room to create or to control the whole climate in the rooms, which is actually not working. To get a very high level of control, you need nearly control every inch of the room. And to get a high control or a measurement of the plants, you have to look at actually every single plant. In the old days, I would say there was a lot of wiring needed for that. Nowadays, there are systems in place which can do a lot of that with cameras and other aspects. So we can get a very high density of data out of the room, which again helps us then to control every aspect in the room. While temperature, humidity, and air are often looked at, sometimes not good enough, but often are in the mind of people, other factors like irrigation or pressure are not as seen as important as they actually are. And therefore, it is important not only controlling temperature, humidity, air, light, nutrition, but also other aspects which influence actually the system very much. For example, if you have an irrigation event and you're watering the whole plants, then your system has to recognize that as quick as possible. And by recognizing it, as well changing the parameters of the air structure, of the temperature structure, so in that you don't see big spikes and changing of the environmental factors. Because again, every change of the environmental factors creates a change of compounds and ingredients itself. So by controlling the environmental factors to the highest point, you're reaching a point of highest standardization of the compounds within the plants. And yes, if you see on the picture, this is a very old picture, like 10 years ago. I actually can't share new ones because of different reasons. But when we started, we had a system which was used by a lot of people, but we realized very soon that it doesn't work. You can't get a standardized product, which is what we actually wanted. As you see, even in this room, you see different plants, heights of plants, and different structures on plants, which makes it impossible to grow really standardized products. But if you have those points I mentioned in mind, then you can create a system which is really, really impressive in how standardized the system and the compounds actually are. One big point which I see often is a big problem, even if you've done your best work in growing and cultivating the product, a lot of the companies don't look in the same severe way on what happens after or while they're harvesting and afterwards. It's quite clear that certain environmental factors are even working on cannabinoids or terpenes after they are harvested. And so it's very important to control not only the cultivation phase and the growing of the plants, but also controlling the environmental conditions very strongly after you harvest the product. And while you do the things like drying, curing, storage, or packaging, it's important to have a system in place which prevents the degradation of cannabinoids and terpenes or flavonoids, and therefore enables you to keep the standardization level you had in the cultivation room also afterwards until the product is packaged. You see often a lot of companies try to make this time frame the shortest one, like from harvest to customer in 5 days or whatever, in 6 days. But yeah, our experience with that is that you should spend more time on this process if you want to have a product which has the highest possible quality, but also have the highest level of standardization of compounds. Because we saw some people, they did good work on cultivation, but then they lost everything afterwards. while that it was not taking care of the preservation of the product in the way it could be or should be done. As mentioned before, a very important part of the work in the facility is always the team. The team needs to know what they're doing, and they needs to getting all help and all assistance they can get to do it in a proper way. Of course, if you're doing GMP again, then you know SOPs and their importance. And it's very important to have defined SOPs that people are actually have no doubts in every second of their workday daily routine, what they should do and what they should not do. But not only SOPs, of course, important. You need to train the people constantly, ongoing, because as everybody knows, if you do this process a while, you tend to do it not in the same amount of attention than you did in the beginning when you was learning it. So constantly, repeatedly schedule trainings and have them validated as the SOPs as well is a very important step to get a standardized process in place. And of course, using software systems for that is something we had the experience helps a lot. It's more digital and more software controlled. You can do those steps as less human error comes in. And also a good thing we realized is using augmented reality systems, not only for training the people, but also having them walking through the lines and actually see within their augmented reality glasses or whatever, what they have to do, where they have to do a cut, where not, which plant needs additional treatment to keep into the deviation we want to have, and so on. It is really not, even if you're having a lot of expert in your facility, we realized it's very helpful to a lot of people to be always on top on the level on information flow to them to enable them to make their best work within the facility. Of course, another important part is, as I mentioned before, is validation. So we use a lot of software in our system. And of course, for software and digital systems, it's important that you have a one-stop all approach, that all your data is collected in one place and that you can overview all aspects of the cultivation, the development of each plant, and so on in for regulatory environments, but also for your own data control and development of new strategies. It's important to have this all validated in a very severe manner. Again, like digital and software components are the same. By changing components like grow mediums, but also lights and air conditions and so on, you're changing the system quite deeply. So it's always important to know how those components will interact with each other and how they need to be validated and controlled, that you have the same system you want to have all the time and ongoing. Because again, changing in the systems are always related to changing in the compounds of the plants itself. Again, as mentioned before, yes, employee work validation is also very important. We use a lot of systems, software-based, but also paper-based, to ensure that every employee that does not only know what he has to do, but also document it in a proper way that we actually can validate their work in a proper way afterwards. This is, of course, again, helpful with regulatory environments, but it's also very, very much needed to control your standardized plant production from the beginning to the end. Of course, all would be not helping enough if you wouldn't look at the plant itself. So measuring the amounts in the plant, looking at the metabolism of the plant, and so on, is very important to know actually, are you in the narrow line of deviation you can accept for your system, or you actually already outside this with some plants, or even one plant. And of course, therefore, again, not only have those processes in place, but validate those processes all the time again to see that everything stays in place and is on the top notch of things. For example, in one picture, you can see there's an old system we used in the past, which was looking into the plant development. Nowadays, the technology is growing further and it's way easier, and you don't need to have a wired installation like that anymore. But again, it's important to have those plants validated because, standardization is really a process where every effect and every variable has to be controlled and measured in any way. Again, as mentioned before, crop-specific process validation means in this case that after the harvest is done, you have to control and, of course, validate everything which is showing your batch control and showing that you have the ability to look at every aspect. I would say, again, many companies do a lot of those things right, but then in the end, when it comes to the crop itself and to the process after harvest, they're lacking a lot of attention to certain factors, which makes it in the end makes them unable to have a standardized plant product. And of course, again, that's what our approach is all the time totally about. We want to have a standardized product, which we can use then as a standardized medicine itself. We realize when we are in contact with regulatory authorities in different areas that a lot of them actually are very happy about an approach like we use them, because as we control our system, they of course can control it as well, because we can present them all the data about all the aspects, about every factor and about every time in the process, which gives them, of course, as well, a feeling of more security and more control about what actually happens. But again, I'm convinced that it's not only important for authorities, but also for you as a company to have those things in place to be able to get a product which is higher quality and better levels of standardization. I'm now at the end of my presentation. Hopefully this short overview was giving you a little insight in what we do and what controlled environment actually means. Thank you.
Thank you, John. This is your applause. Thank you very much. Has anyone a question? He can hear you. You can applause.